The day that changed Serafina Drake's life forever began like any other, with the sound of the bell calling the field hands before sunrise. The air was thick with Mississippi humidity, and a pale fog clung low to the cotton rows. Ruth was already awake, scrubbing a blood stain from one of the mistress's dresses, her fingers raw and aching. Serafina sat quietly in the corner of the cabin, knees pulled to her chest, watching her mother work. That morning, Helena Whitmore decided to conduct an inspection of the domestic quarters herself. It was not unusual for Helena to wander the grounds when her mood darkened. On days when she felt the weight of her fading youth most heavily, she searched for flaws in others. A crooked hem, a smudge on silverware, a bowed head not bowed deeply enough. She came upon Ruth's cabin unexpectedly. The door was open to let out steam from boiling laundry water. Serafina stood to help her mother lift a heavy basket, and for just a moment, sunlight struck her face directly. Helena stopped. She did not breathe. For a long second, the world seemed to still around her. The girl before her was not merely beautiful. She was disturbingly so. Too perfect. Too luminous. The kind of beauty that drew the eye against one's will. The kind that made comparison inevitable and cruel. Helena felt something sharp twist inside her chest. Not desire, not curiosity, but hatred. That night, Helena did not sleep. She stood before her mirror long after the candles burned low, pulling at the skin beneath her eyes, studying every line, every shadow. Again and again, Serafina's face appeared in her mind. Young, untouched by time, radiant in a way Helena knew she would never be again. By morning, she had made her decision. The punishment that wasn't a punishment. Helena did not accuse Serafina of wrongdoing. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She summoned Ruth to the main house and spoke softly, with the calm authority of someone who knew she held absolute power. That child, she said, sipping her tea, is a distraction. Ruth felt her stomach drop. She draws attention. Attention leads to trouble. I will not have disorder in my household. Ruth begged. She knelt. She cried. She promised obedience, promised to keep Serafina hidden, promised anything Helena demanded. Helena listened patiently. Then she said, "You should be grateful. I am protecting her." That afternoon, Serafina was taken. Not to the fields, not to the house, but to a narrow root cellar beneath an unused storage shed, half buried in earth, with no windows and only one heavy iron door. Chains were fastened to the stone wall. Helena called it seclusion. In truth, it was a living grave. Serafina was 7 years old, 10 years in the dark. For 10 long years, Serafina Drake lived in near total darkness. She was allowed outside only at night and only briefly to wash under supervision. She was forbidden from speaking to anyone except the woman who brought her food, an older enslaved cook who slipped her scraps and whispered prayers through tears. Ruth was allowed to see her daughter once a week. Once, under watch. Each visit, Serafina grew thinner, taller, quieter, but her beauty did not fade. If anything, the isolation made it more haunting. Her eyes adapted to darkness, glowing faintly in torchlight. Her skin remained unblemished, untouched by sun or labor. She became something unnatural in the minds of those who glimpsed her, rumor, a ghost, a curse. The other enslaved people spoke of her in hushed tones. The angel in chains. The girl, the mistress hid from God. Ruth aged rapidly. Her hair grayed. Her back bent. Every time she left that cellar, she left a piece of herself behind. Helena never went near the shed again. She did not need to. Knowing Serafina was hidden was enough. The war comes. In 1861, the world outside the plantation caught fire. The Civil War reached Mississippi like a slow-moving storm. Men left to fight. Cotton rotted in fields. Union rumors spread like wildfire through enslaved quarters, whispers of freedom, of marching bluecoats, of chains broken. By 1863, Union troops moved through Warren County. The Whitmore plantation was abandoned in haste. In the chaos, Helena Whitmore fled with her sons, taking silver, documents, and whatever dignity she could carry. She forgot one thing: the girl in chains. It was Ruth who remembered. Ruth, barely able to walk, stole the key from the empty house and ran for the first time in her life, to the shed behind the fields. She unlocked the door. Light poured in. Seraphina stepped forward, blinded, shaking, her chains clattering to the ground. She was 17 years old. After freedom, Seraphina Drake was free. But freedom did not come with healing. She had never learned to run, never learned to choose, never learned how to exist in a world without walls. Ruth died 6 months later, her body simply giving up after decades of survival. Seraphina buried her mother with her own hands. After the war, she disappeared from official records. Some say she went north, where her beauty finally belonged to her alone. Others say she never spoke again. That silence had become her language. But in Warren County, people remembered. They remembered the mistress who feared youth more than sin. They remembered the girl whose beauty was treated as a crime. And they remembered this truth: slavery did not end with whips alone. Sometimes it ended with silence, darkness, and 10 stolen years that could never be returned. For most of the time, the darkness pressed in on Seraphina like a living thing. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mold, and old wine barrels. The stone walls sweated constantly, cold moisture seeping into her thin dress and chilling her bones. Somewhere above her, she could hear the faint sounds of life continuing as if nothing had changed, footsteps crossing the floor, dishes clinking, laughter drifting down through layers of wood and stone. The sounds were muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. They were reminders that the world she had known still existed, just out of reach. On the second day, Helena Whitmore came to see her. She did not come alone. She brought a lantern, its flame flickering against the cellar walls, and she brought silence with her, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier. Seraphina shrank back as far as the chain would allow, pressing herself into the cold stone. Her ankle was swollen and bleeding where the iron rubbed raw skin. She did not understand why she was here. She only knew that the woman standing before her was the reason. Helena said nothing at first. She simply raised the lantern and studied the child as if examining an object for flaws. The light revealed Seraphina's tear-streaked face, her tangled hair, her wide amber eyes filled with terror. For a brief moment, so brief it might never have existed, something flickered across Helena's expression. Not pity, not remorse. Something closer to triumph. "You will stay here," Helena said finally, her voice calm, measured, almost gentle. "You will speak to no one unless spoken to. You will be quiet. You will be forgotten." Seraphina opened her mouth to call for her mother, but Helena lifted one gloved hand. "If you scream," she said softly, "they will hear you. And if they hear you, your mother will suffer for it. Do you understand?" The child nodded. Fear had already taught her obedience. From that day on, Seraphina's existence became something hidden between the walls of the Whitmore mansion. Food was brought once a day, usually stale bread, sometimes a small bowl of thin stew left at the bottom of the stairs without a word. Water came in a chipped tin cup. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her longer than necessary. The overseer made sure the chain remained secure. Helena made sure no one forgot who was responsible. Above ground, Ruth aged rapidly. She worked longer hours. She spoke less. At night, when no one could hear her, she wept into the dirt floor of her cabin, pressing her face into the same earth that now imprisoned her daughter. She tried to leave scraps of food near the cellar door when she could, risking punishment each time. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they did not. Years passed. Serafina grew from a child into a young woman in that cellar. Her body changed in the darkness, marked by hunger and confinement. She learned the rhythm of the house by sound alone, the morning bells, the evening meals, the quiet hours after midnight, when even the walls seemed asleep. She marked time by the thin blade of sunlight that appeared each afternoon, shifting slowly across the stone like a silent clock. She learned to survive in stillness. Helena Whitmore grew older too. Her hair grayed. Her sons left for school, and then for war. The Civil War came and tore through Mississippi like a storm. Cannon fire echoed in the distance. Rumors of Union troops spread fear through the plantation. Enslaved, people whispered about freedom, about escape, about a world beyond the fields. But even as the world above changed, the cellar remained the same. When Union soldiers finally arrived in Warren County in 1863, the Whitmore plantation was abandoned in haste. Helena fled with what valuables she could carry. The cellar door was locked. No one remembers exactly how long Serafina remained chained after that. What historians know comes from fragments, records, testimony, and what was found decades later when the ruins of the Whitmore mansion were excavated. In the far back corner of the cellar, behind collapsed stone and rotted wood, they found an iron ring embedded in the wall. They found a length of chain, and beside it, etched faintly into the stone with what may have been a nail or a shard of metal, they found markings, tallies scratched one by one, counting years. 10 of them. Serafina Drake did not leave a written diary. She was never taught to read or write. But her story survived anyway, carried through oral histories, through whispered accounts passed down by those who remembered Ruth's grief, through the physical evidence that refused to stay buried. Today, historians consider her story one of the most haunting examples of how jealousy, power, and dehumanization could destroy a life without ever raising a whip. Serafina was not killed in a moment of rage. She was erased slowly, deliberately, hidden away until the world forgot she existed. And yet, somehow, the world remembered. Because stories like hers do not disappear. They wait, in stone walls, in rusted iron, in silence. And when they finally surface, they demand to be heard. As Serafina's memory sharpened, so did her understanding of the world that had imprisoned her. From the fragments of conversation she overheard, she reconstructed events far beyond the cellar walls. She learned of laws she would never see, of cities she would never walk through, of a war that was reshaping the nation above her head. The names Lincoln, secession, and emancipation filtered down through the floorboards like rumors from another universe. She did not know exactly what they meant, but she understood one thing with absolute clarity: change was coming. The sounds of the house changed as well. Where once there had been confidence and routine, there was now tension. Voices grew sharper. Footsteps became hurried. The laughter that had once floated down into the cellar disappeared entirely. The Whitmore household was no longer the fortress it had once been. Fear had moved in, settling into the walls alongside Serafina. Helena's visits became less frequent, but when they did occur, they were more volatile. She would descend the cellar steps carrying a lantern, her face tight, with anger, her movements abrupt. She never acknowledged Serafina, directly. Instead, she spoke to the darkness itself, venting her frustrations about the world slipping beyond her control. Union advances, financial ruin, disloyal servants, ungrateful sons. Seraphina listened to every word, absorbing Helena's fear the way dry earth absorbs rain. The power dynamic had shifted, though Helena did not realize it. By her 5th year in captivity, Seraphina understood something profound. Helena Whitmore was unraveling. The woman who had once ruled the plantation with absolute authority was now haunted by the very system she depended on. The war threatened her wealth. Age threatened her beauty. And the cellar, though she would never admit it, threatened her conscience. Helena began drinking heavily. Seraphina could hear the clink of bottles, the slurred arguments, the pacing footsteps late at night. Sometimes Helena stood at the top of the cellar stairs for long stretches of time, saying nothing, as if debating whether to open the door or pretend it had never existed. The door always remained closed. Above all, Seraphina listened for her mother. For years, she heard Ruth's footsteps in the laundry rooms overhead. She recognized her cough. She memorized the rhythm of her movements. But as time passed, those sounds grew weaker, then less frequent, and finally stopped altogether. No announcement was made. No explanation reached the cellar. Ruth simply vanished from the soundscape of the house. Seraphina never learned whether her mother was sold, died from exhaustion, or simply faded away under the weight of grief. The absence carved something hollow inside her that even imagination could not fill. By the 7th year, Seraphina no longer screamed when the door opened. She no longer begged. She accepted the food in silence, conserving energy, conserving breath, conserving purpose. She had learned that survival was not loud. Survival was patient. Then, one night, everything changed. The sounds that reached her ears were unlike any she had heard before. Boots, heavy, unfamiliar boots, crossed the floor above her. Male voices, tense and commanding. The unmistakable clatter of weapons. Panic rippled through the house like a shockwave. Orders were shouted. Furniture was moved. Papers were gathered in haste. Union soldiers had arrived. Seraphina pressed her ear to the wall, her heart pounding so violently she feared it would give her away. She listened as the Whitmore sons argued, as Helena's voice rose in shrill desperation, as Colonel Whitmore barked orders that no one seemed eager to obey. And then, just as suddenly as the chaos had begun, it moved away. The house emptied. Footsteps retreated. Doors slammed. Silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence now. A hollow one. Hours passed. Then days. No food came. No footsteps echoed overhead. No voices filtered through the floorboards. For the first time in 10 years, Seraphina was truly alone. Not just unseen, but forgotten. Hunger gnawed at her sharper than ever before. Thirst burned her throat. She called out, weakly at first, then louder, her voice echoing uselessly off the stone walls. No one answered. The mansion above her had been abandoned. The world had moved on. It was in that silence, on the edge between life and death, that Seraphina made a decision. If she was going to die, she would not die chained in the dark like an object someone had misplaced. She began to test the limits of her prison. She pulled against the chain, not in panic, but with calculation. She examined the iron ring embedded in the wall, running her fingers over its rusted edges. Time, moisture, and neglect had weakened more than just human resolve. The cellar itself was decaying. For the first time since she was a child, Seraphina allowed herself to imagine something real. Escape. And with that thought, fragile but powerful, the darkness around her seemed just a little less absolute. She learned to stretch what little food she received, breaking each portion into smaller and smaller pieces, forcing her body to adapt once again. Hunger became familiar, almost companionable. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything else. How it dulled the senses at first, then sharpened them, how it made time feel elastic, how it stripped life down to its most essential impulses: survival, observation, waiting. Above her, the plantation decayed. By mid-1864, the Whitmore mansion no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like a place under siege. Furniture was sold off, quietly, to creditors. The piano in the parlor, once the pride of Helena's social gatherings, was removed one night, its legs scraping loudly across the floorboards as it was dragged away. Serafina listened as Helena wept openly for the first time, her sobs raw and unrestrained. The woman who had once ruled through fear was now ruled by it. The enslaved population sensed opportunity. Serafina heard whispered conversations about escape, about Union lines drawing closer, about entire plantations being abandoned overnight. Names of neighboring estates floated down into the cellar, places where masters had fled, leaving chains unlocked and gates open. Hope moved through the quarters like a current, invisible but powerful. Then came the fire. It began late one evening, a sharp crack followed by shouting. Serafina smelled smoke before she heard it, the scent drifting down into the cellar through cracks in the foundation. Panic erupted above her. Boots thundered across the floor. Someone screamed for water. Someone else shouted orders that no one obeyed. The house servants ran, their footsteps chaotic, no longer measured or restrained. The fire did not consume the mansion, but it changed everything. In the aftermath, Helena's control evaporated completely. She blamed everyone: the servants, the war, God. Her voice, once commanding, now carried hysteria. Serafina heard her threaten sales that never came, punishments she no longer had the power to enforce. The overseers were gone. The sons were either absent or broken. The plantation was unraveling thread by thread. And still, no one remembered the cellar. Days passed without food. Serafina's body weakened, but her mind remained steady. She understood something crucial now. Neglect was as deadly as cruelty, but it also created opportunity. The iron ring in the wall had loosened further. Each time she pulled against a chain, she felt it shift, barely perceptible, but real. Rust flaked away beneath her fingers. The wall itself was crumbling, the mortar softened by decades of moisture. One night, driven not by desperation, but by clarity, Serafina wrapped the chain around her hands and pulled with everything she had left. Pain exploded through her ankle. She nearly blacked out. But then, there was a sound she had never heard before. A crack. She froze, listening, breath held. Nothing above her stirred. She pulled again. This time, the iron ring shifted visibly, tearing free from the weakened stone with a low, grinding groan. Serafina collapsed backward onto the dirt floor, clutching the chain in disbelief. She was still bound, but no longer anchored. For several minutes, she lay there, trembling, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. 10 years in darkness, and now the wall itself had yielded. Freedom was no longer theoretical, it was physical. It hurt. It was terrifying. And it was close. Serafina did not rush. She knew better than to let emotion dictate action. She waited until night deepened, until the sounds above dwindled to nothing. Then she stood, her legs shaking beneath her, and began to move. She tested the cellar door. Locked, but locks, she had learned from listening, were only as strong as the people who remembered to use them properly. Helena had grown careless. The plantation had grown distracted. With slow, deliberate movements, Serafina began to push upward, her shoulder braced against the door, applying pressure not in force, but in patience. Wood creaked, dust fell, and then, after 10 years of darkness, the door shifted. A thin line of light spilled into the cellar, blinding her. Serafina closed her eyes, tears burning her sight for the first time in years, not from grief, but from the unbearable brilliance of possibility. She had survived what was meant to erase her, and now, the world that had buried her was about to learn what it had created. Temporary inconvenience that would surely be corrected once proper order was restored. But the cracks in her illusion were widening by the day. Union soldiers arrived in Vicksburg first, their blue uniforms unmistakable even from a distance. Word traveled fast. Freedom was no longer a rumor whispered in slave quarters. It was being spoken aloud, proclaimed, enforced. Serafina heard the word emancipation repeated again and again above her head, each time like a distant bell tolling the end of one world and the beginning of another. Helena reacted to this news not with grief, but with fury. Serafina listened as she raged through the house, accusing servants of ingratitude, of treachery, of plotting against her. She spoke bitterly of President Lincoln, of Northern barbarism, of a society turned upside down. Yet beneath the anger was something else, panic. The authority Helena had wielded for decades was evaporating, and she had no idea how to exist without it. The colonel was a diminished man now. James Whitmore no longer delivered speeches or discussed politics with confidence. His voice had grown thin, uncertain. He spent long hours staring out of the windows or sitting silently in his study, hands trembling as he read newspapers filled with words he could not accept. Defeat, occupation, reconstruction. The future was arriving whether he welcomed it or not. And still, no one remembered the cellar. On a gray morning in late May of 1865, Union cavalry finally rode onto the Whitmore plantation. Serafina heard the thunder of hooves, the sharp commands, shouted in unfamiliar accents, the unmistakable sound of rifles being handled by men who knew how to use them. The remaining servants rushed to the front of the house. Helena demanded explanations. The colonel said very little. From her place beneath the earth, Serafina listened as a Union officer read aloud the terms that now govern the land. Enslaved people were free. Property would be inventoried. Allegations of abuse would be investigated. The officer's voice was calm, procedural, utterly indifferent to Helena's outrage. That was when Serafina knew she could wait no longer. That night, after the soldiers had made camp near the main house, after the plantation had fallen into an uneasy silence, Serafina rose. She wrapped the loose chain around her waist and braced herself against the cellar door once more. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort of forcing a body that had been confined for years to remember how to move. She pushed. The weakened latch finally gave way with a muted crack. The door swung open, just enough to allow her through. Light flooded down the steps, moonlight, pale and cold, but more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. Serafina shielded her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to hide, but she did not. She climbed. Each step was agony. Her legs buckled, her muscles screamed in protest, her lungs burned with air they were no longer accustomed to drawing in such quantity. But she climbed anyway, driven by something stronger than pain. When she emerged into the open air, Serafina collapsed onto the cellar floor, sobbing, not loudly but silently, her body convulsing as sensation overwhelmed her. The smell of earth and grass, the vastness of the sky, the sound of insects, of distant voices, of life continuing all around her. She was free, barefoot, wrapped in rags, her hair matted and her skin ghostly pale from years without sun. Seraphina Drake crawled out from beneath the Whitmore mansion like a specter rising from the grave. She did not run. She did not hide. She stood, unsteady but upright, and walked toward the light of the soldiers' camp. When she reached the edge of the clearing, a Union sentry spotted her and shouted in alarm. Rifles were raised. Commands were barked. Seraphina lifted her hands, not in surrender, but to show the iron chain still looped around her ankle, the rusted shackle that told her story more clearly than words ever could. An officer approached cautiously, his face hardening as he took in her condition. "Who are you?" he asked. Seraphina opened her mouth. Her voice, unused for years, came out hoarse and broken, but steady. "My name," she said, "is Seraphina Drake, and I was kept in that cellar for 10 years. What followed would unravel the last illusion the Whitmore family clung to. Union investigators descended on the mansion before dawn. The cellar was examined. The iron ring torn from the wall was documented. The chains were photographed, measured, entered into record. Witnesses were questioned. Servants who had been too afraid to speak before now told what they knew. And Helena Whitmore, confronted with the living proof of her cruelty, said nothing. She did not deny it. She did not explain it. She simply stared at Seraphina with the same expression she had worn 10 years earlier. The look of a woman facing something she could not accept. Helena Whitmore was arrested on charges of unlawful imprisonment and extreme cruelty. James Whitmore was taken into custody as well, not for ordering the act, but for allowing it to continue. The plantation was seized. The remaining enslaved people were formally declared free. Seraphina Drake was taken to a Union field hospital. Doctors marveled that she was alive at all. Her body was broken, but her mind was intact, sharp, observant, unyielding. When questioned, she spoke calmly, methodically, recounting details no one else could have known. Financial crimes, acts of violence, secrets whispered in confidence over dinner tables. Her testimony was devastating. She did not ask for vengeance. She asked only that the truth be written down. Seraphina never returned to the Whitmore plantation. She left Mississippi later that year, heading north with the assistance of the Freedmen's Bureau. Records suggest she learned to read and write within 2 years. She worked first as a domestic, then as a teacher's assistant. Some accounts say she eventually became a lecturer, speaking quietly but powerfully about what had been done to her. No photograph of Seraphina Drake survives, but her name appears in court transcripts, military reports, and abolitionist newspapers of the late 1860s. Always described the same way. Calm, composed, unbroken. The Whitmore mansion fell into ruin within a decade, and somewhere beyond its crumbling cellar walls, a woman who had been buried alive learned how to live again. Not by forgetting the darkness, but by carrying it into the light where it could no longer hide. They will protect you now. That is what they are saying. That is what freedom means. Seraphina nodded, though the word freedom still felt unreal in her mouth, like a language she had never been taught to speak. Bessie wrapped a rough shawl around her shoulders and pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. Inside were a piece of cornbread, a tin cup, and a folded scrap of paper with directions drawn in charcoal, simple marks showing the road that led away from the plantation toward Vicksburg. "Go through the trees," Bessie whispered. "Stay off the main road. Walk at night if you can, and don't look back." Seraphina did look back just once. She stood in the shadow of the great house, her bare feet pressed into the cool earth, and stared at the mansion that had swallowed her childhood. The white columns were cracked now, the paint peeling the windows dark. It no longer looked powerful. It looked hollow. A shell. A tomb. She turned and disappeared into the trees. The journey to Vicksburg took 3 days. Serafina moved slowly, her body rebelling against every step. Her legs trembled constantly, and more than once she collapsed to the ground, certain she could not go on. But each time, she remembered her mother's voice, the whispered messages carried through food bowls years ago. "Stay strong. I'm still here." And she forced herself to rise again. On the second night, she encountered Union soldiers camping near a crossroads. At first they shouted, hands on rifles, startled by the sight of a thin, ghost-like woman emerging from the darkness. But when they saw the chain still locked around her ankle, their expressions changed. One of them swore softly. Another removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She was taken to a field hospital on the outskirts of the city. Doctors examined her in stunned silence. Malnutrition, muscle wasting, infections long healed badly, scars that told a story no one wanted to hear. When they asked her how long she had been imprisoned, she answered calmly, 10 years. The word spread quickly. Union officers launched an investigation within days. When they searched the Whitmore plantation and found the cellar, the iron ring, the chain, the scratch marks on the stone floor, Helena Whitmore could no longer pretend. She screamed. She accused. She claimed madness, claimed discipline, claimed property rights that no longer existed. None of it mattered. Helena Whitmore was arrested. Colonel James Whitmore died 3 months later, his liver destroyed by years of drink. William Whitmore was ruined financially and fled west. Robert was never found. Thomas, Jr. testified, weeping, confessing that he had known there was someone in the cellar but had been too afraid of his mother to speak. His testimony spared him prison, but not shame. He left Mississippi under a cloud that followed him for the rest of his life. Serafina Drake testified once. She spoke without hatred, without tears. She described the darkness, the silence, the chain, the voices above her head. She named names. She recited conversations word for word. The courtroom was silent as a grave when she finished. Helena Whitmore was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and extreme cruelty. She died in prison 2 years later, still insisting she had done nothing wrong. Serafina never returned to Warren County. Records show she learned to read within a year. She chose her own last name. She worked first with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping locate families torn apart by slavery. Later, she taught children, black and white, to read and write, believing that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever chain again. She rarely spoke of the cellar, but when she did, she said this: "They tried to erase me by hiding me. Instead, they gave me time, and time taught me everything." Serafina Drake vanished from the records sometime in the late 1870s. No grave has been found. No photograph survives. But in Warren County, there is still an old saying passed down through generations. Be careful what you bury in the dark, because some things learn how to wait. The carefully constructed world she had built was beginning to fracture, and Helena Whitmore could feel it in her bones. The plantation no longer obeyed her. Servants moved slower, spoke less, and when they thought she was not looking, they looked at her differently. Not with fear, with calculation, with something dangerously close to judgment. The war had not only destroyed the South's economy, it had shattered the illusion of unquestioned authority. And Helena, who had ruled through fear and precision for decades, found that fear was evaporating. At night, she could not sleep. She lay awake in her massive four-poster bed, listening to the old house breathe and creak around her. Every sound felt intentional now. Every whisper of wind through the shutters sounded like footsteps. Every groan of timber felt like the house shifting its weight, adjusting to something new, something unwelcome. She began to dream. In those dreams, The cellar door was always open. She would walk down the stairs, candle in hand, calling Serafina's name, not with cruelty but with panic. And when she reached the bottom, the cellar was empty. The chain lay broken on the floor. The ring was torn from the stone, leaving a jagged scar in the wall. And then she would feel it, breath on the back of her neck. Helena woke every night, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding so violently she feared it would wake the whole house. She told herself it was stress, hunger, exhaustion, the consequence of a world turned upside down. She did not allow herself to consider the other possibility. Meanwhile, below her feet, in the darkness she believed still held her secret, Serafina listened. She listened to Helena's pacing. She listened to the arguments between husband and wife, the colonel's voice weak and slurred, Helena's sharp and cutting, cracking despite her efforts to maintain control. She listened to Thomas Jr. crying softly into his pillow some nights, the sound of a boy who had grown up believing lies and was now too fragile to survive their collapse. Serafina learned everything. She learned that Helena had begun burning papers in the fireplace late at night. She learned that creditors' letters were being hidden, then destroyed. She learned that Helena had started locking her bedroom door, something she had never done before. Fear had entered the mistress's blood, and Serafina fed on it. She began to leave small signs. Nothing obvious. Nothing that could be proven. A chair moved slightly from where it had been left. A door found unlocked in the morning that Helena knew she had secured. A document reappearing on a desk after Helena was certain she had burned it. Just enough to make Helena doubt herself. Just enough to make her wonder if the madness she feared in others had finally taken root in her own mind. One evening, Helena stood alone in her office, staring at the empty space where a ledger had once been. Her hands trembled. She pressed them flat against the desk, breathing hard. "This is not possible," she whispered. From the darkness beyond the doorway, unseen and unheard, Serafina watched. She had waited 6 years. She could wait a little longer, because the reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, Helena Whitmore would not be allowed the mercy of confusion. She would understand everything. Serafina stepped aside effortlessly, and Helena crashed into the dining table, sending dishes shattering across the floor. Her cries were raw, unhinged, the sound of a woman who had believed herself untouchable now confronting a nightmare made flesh. "Your sons," Serafina said, her amber eyes steady, focused on the colonel. "They are not your sons. They are not your wife's sons. They were purchased from a slave trader, light-skinned children who could pass for white. Your wife has been lying to you for over 30 years. The colonel's face turned gray as he stared at the letter in her hand. He looked at Helena, who now sobbed uncontrollably, collapsed against the table. The perfect facade of wealth, power, and social standing that Helena had spent decades constructing was crumbling before their eyes. Thomas Jr., the youngest, sat frozen, unable to process the truth. Everything he had believed about himself, his identity, his lineage, his place in the world, was unraveling in the span of minutes. The destruction of the Whitmore family was swift and absolute. Confronted with the enormity of Helena's deception, the colonel suffered a stroke within hours. He survived, but was left partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. He spent the rest of his days in a wheelchair, dependent on a handful of servants who were now free and had to be paid wages beyond the family's diminished means. Helena Whitmore was arrested just 2 days later. Serafina had sent copies of the incriminating documents to the Union military commander in Vicksburg, along with a detailed account of her own imprisonment. The authorities, eager to demonstrate justice in the post-war South, had the perfect case. Helena, A wealthy white woman who had imprisoned a child for 6 years was tried by military tribunal and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She never survived long in captivity, dying of typhoid less than 2 years later. The 3 Whitmore sons scattered. William, the eldest, could not accept the truth about his origins. Overwhelmed by despair, he took his own life 3 weeks later. Robert, the middle son, vanished entirely. Some whispered that he fled west to California to escape his history, while others claimed he drank himself to death in a New Orleans boarding house. Thomas Jr., the youngest, reacted differently. He sought out Serafina, desperate to learn about his real mother. Though records were incomplete and the trail cold after decades, Serafina gave him what she could. He eventually moved north to Philadelphia, living as a black man and dedicating his life to teaching the children of free people. The Whitmore plantation itself was seized by the federal government. The great mansion, once a symbol of unchecked white wealth, was divided into apartments for 3 black families. The cotton fields were parceled out into small farms. The world that James and Helena Whitmore had built was not just destroyed. It was transformed into a thriving community of free people living on land they now owned. And Serafina walked away. She left Warren County in the summer of 1865, alone, penniless, with no surviving family. Yet she carried with her something more valuable than any fortune. She had survived, she had endured, and she had reclaimed power from the very people who had tried to annihilate her. The years of patience, observation, and quiet calculation had culminated in justice served, not through violence, but through truth. She traveled north, Memphis, St. Louis, Chicago, working as a domestic servant, seamstress, and cook, saving every penny she earned. She taught herself to read and write, mastering letters and newspapers discarded in the houses where she worked. By 1870, she had enough to open a modest boarding house in Chicago, serving the growing black community. For 23 years, she offered clean rooms and hot meals to travelers turned away from white establishments. Serafina never married, never had children. She rarely spoke of her past, never mentioning the cellar, Helena, or the Whitmore secrets. That chapter of her life was closed, but she kept one relic, the chain that had bound her ankle for 6 long years, hidden beneath a floorboard in her bedroom. She sometimes took it out at night, running her fingers over the cold, rusted iron. She did not keep it for nostalgia, but as a reminder of survival, a reminder of patience, a reminder that the human spirit, even when broken and buried in darkness, can endure and rise stronger than anyone could imagine. Serafina Drake had been imprisoned, hidden, and nearly erased. Yet, in the end, she emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor, a strategist, and a force that reshaped the world around her. Her story traveled quietly, whispered among freed people, passed down in memory and legend. A tale of darkness and endurance, of cruelty met with cunning, and a woman who refused to be diminished by the chains of others. And long after the last Whitmore fell, Serafina walked freely, carrying the light of knowledge, resilience, and unbroken will. She kept it as a reminder of what human beings were capable of doing to each other, a reminder of what she had endured and overcome, a reminder that no matter how dark the darkness became, there was always a way back to the light. Serafina Drake died in Chicago on February 14, 1912. She was 60 years old. The obituary in the Chicago Defender described her as a respected businesswoman and a pillar of her community. It mentioned her boarding house, her charitable work with newly arrived migrants from the South, her quiet dignity and strength. It did not mention Mississippi. It did not mention the White Earth. It did not mention the cellar. But there were those who knew. Old Bessie, who lived until 1889, told the story to her grandchildren before she died. Some of the formerly enslaved people who had worked on the Whitmore plantation shared whispered accounts of the girl who had emerged from the darkness and destroyed her captives with nothing but the truth. The story passed down through generations, changing and growing as oral histories do until it became more legend than fact. And perhaps that is fitting because the story of Seraphina Drake is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of everyone who has ever been buried alive by injustice. And yet, she found a way to rise. This is the story of the secrets that oppressors try to bury and the truth that always finds a way to surface. It is the story of a beauty that could not be destroyed, a spirit that could not be broken, and a vengeance that was as patient as it was complete. Helena Whitmore had tried to bury Seraphina in darkness because she could not bear to look at her. She believed that by hiding the girl away, she could pretend she did not exist. She thought chains and stone walls, years of isolation, would destroy what she herself could never possess. She was wrong. The darkness did not destroy Seraphina. It forged her. It made her sharper, stronger, and more patient than any enemy could imagine. It taught her to listen when others spoke carelessly. It taught her to remember when others forgot. It revealed the truth she would carry for the rest of her life, that the cruelty of the powerful is always built on secrets, and that secrets are the most fragile foundations of all. In the end, Helena Whitmore was undone not by force, but by truth, not by violence, but by patience, not by hatred, but by the simple, unstoppable power of a human being who refused to be erased. She spent years trying to hide Seraphina from the world, but the world has a way of finding what is hidden, and sometimes what emerges from the darkness is more powerful than what put it there. This is the story of Seraphina Drake, the prisoner of beauty, the girl in the cellar, the woman who waited nearly a decade in darkness and emerged to bring light to those who had wronged her. Her story was buried for over a century, lost in the vast ocean of suffering that was American slavery. But stories like hers have a way of surfacing. They rise through the cracks in history, demanding to be heard, because the truth cannot be chained forever. Beauty, real beauty, the beauty of the human spirit, can survive anything, even 6 years of darkness, even a lifetime of injustice, even the determined cruelty of those who fear what they cannot control. Seraphina Drake knew this. She learned it in the cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion, in the endless darkness where she should have been destroyed. She carried that knowledge with her for the rest of her life. And now, more than a century after her death, her story carries it forward still. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of secrets and lies. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only a matter of time. And Seraphina, she had all the time in the world, and yet she found a way to rise. This is the story of the secrets that oppressors try to bury and the truth that always finds a way to surface. It is the story of a beauty that could not be destroyed, a spirit that could not be broken, and a vengeance that was as patient as it was complete. Helena Whitmore had tried to bury Seraphina in darkness because she could not bear to look at her. She believed that by hiding the girl away, she could pretend she did not exist. She thought chains and stone walls, years of isolation, would destroy what she herself could never possess. She was wrong. The darkness did not destroy Seraphina. It forged her. It made her sharper, stronger, and more patient than any enemy could imagine. It taught her to listen when others spoke carelessly. It taught her to remember when others forgot. It revealed the truth she would carry for the rest of her life, that the cruelty of the powerful is always built on secrets, and that secrets are the most fragile foundations of all. In the end, Helena Whitmore was undone not by force, but by truth, not by violence, but by patience, not by hatred, but by the simple, unstoppable power of a human being who refused to be erased. She spent years trying to hide Seraphina from the world, but the world has a way of finding what is hidden. And sometimes, what emerges from the darkness is more powerful than what put it there. Part 2, Freedom and Legacy. This is the story of Seraphina Drake, the prisoner of beauty, the girl in the cellar, the woman who waited nearly a decade in darkness and emerged to bring light to those who had wronged her. Her story was buried for over a century, lost in the vast ocean of suffering that was American slavery. But stories like hers have a way of surfacing. They rise through the cracks in history, demanding to be heard, because the truth cannot be chained forever. Beauty, real beauty, the beauty of the human spirit, can survive anything. Even 6 years of darkness, even a lifetime of injustice, even the determined cruelty of those who fear what they cannot control. Seraphina Drake knew this. She learned it in the cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion, in the endless darkness where she should have been destroyed. She carried that knowledge with her for the rest of her life. And now, more than a century after her death, her story carries it forward still. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of secrets and lies. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only a matter of time. And Seraphina, she had all the time in the world, and yet she had survived. In the cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion, where darkness had once seemed eternal, Seraphina had discovered something no one could take from her: patience, clarity, and the unshakable power of knowledge. Those walls that had been meant to destroy her, those chains that had cut into her ankle, had done something else entirely. They had made her formidable. They had made her unbreakable. The world above was crumbling. Helena Whitmore, the woman who had tried to erase her, was powerless. The colonel, drunk on pride and denial, had no idea of the secret that had been kept from him all these years. And the sons, the so-called heirs of the Whitmore legacy, were about to discover the truth that would undo everything they believed about themselves, about their family, about the world they thought was theirs. Seraphina waited. She had become a shadow in the darkness, a mind honed to perfection by isolation. She had learned to listen, to remember, to anticipate. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of conversation, every clatter of dishes above her head had been catalogued in her mind. She knew exactly when to act, how to move, and what would break the fragile illusions of the household that had enslaved her for so long. And when the moment came, she emerged like lightning, quiet, precise, and unstoppable. The family saw her and understood nothing. Helena screamed as if she were staring into the grave itself. The colonel's confusion froze him in place. Thomas Jr. could not comprehend the betrayal of his own life. And Seraphina spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, a blade hidden inside silk. She revealed every secret. The cellar, the chains, the starvation, the stolen childhood, the lies about the son's origins, all of it. Helena's carefully constructed world collapsed in minutes. Her arrogance, her vanity, her cruelty, all undone by the one person she had tried to destroy. And the colonel, who had once claimed ownership over the lives of hundreds, could only watch in horror as truth shattered the illusions of his family. The consequences were swift. Helena was arrested. Seraphina ensured that the incriminating documents reached the Union authorities. The sons scattered, some destroyed by despair, others disappearing into the wide world to wrestle with truths they could not escape. The plantation, the symbol of the Whitmore power, was seized, divided, and redistributed. Formerly enslaved, people reclaimed the land that had been stolen from them, planting seeds of freedom in the very soil that had been soaked with injustice. And Serafina walked away. She left Warren County in the summer of 1865, carrying nothing but herself, her memories, and the lessons of the darkness. The chain that had bound her for nearly 6 years rested in a small wooden box hidden under a floorboard, a reminder of what had tried to hold her down and what she had overcome. She traveled north, working as a domestic servant, a cook, a seamstress, and learning everything she could. She taught herself to read and write, mastering the written word with the same patience and precision that had kept her alive in the cellar. By 1870, she opened a small boarding house in Chicago, a place of safety and opportunity for black travelers turned away from white establishments. For over 2 decades, she provided clean rooms, hot meals, and a quiet sanctuary for those building lives in freedom, all while quietly building her own independence, her own legacy. Serafina never married. She never had children. She carried the weight of her past with dignity, knowing that she had survived something most people could not imagine. And yet she had emerged not broken, but whole. Her life was proof that the human spirit, even in the darkest conditions, could endure. It could adapt. It could rise. And the darkness of her past, the chains, the silence, the cruelty became her teacher. She learned that power is often disguised as fear, and that those who try to hide the truth are always vulnerable to it. She had spent years learning the secrets of the people who thought they controlled her, and in time, those secrets became the instruments of justice. She had waited. She had prepared. She had emerged when the time was right. Even more than freedom, Serafina carried knowledge. Knowledge of human weakness. Knowledge of the fragility of lies. Knowledge that patience and truth were weapons stronger than any whip, any chain, any act of cruelty. And with that knowledge, she moved through the world quietly but deliberately, leaving behind a legacy of justice, of survival, of triumph over those who believe themselves untouchable. Her story was buried for over a century, lost in the shadows of history. But like all truths, it found its way to the light. Serafina Drake, the prisoner of beauty, the girl in the cellar, the woman who endured darkness and emerged to claim her life, teaches us that the spirit cannot be chained, that the human soul cannot be destroyed, and that the power of patience, knowledge, and courage can reshape the world. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of secrets and lies. Both can be broken. And Serafina, she had all the time in the world. Her story lives on, echoing through history as a testament to endurance, justice, and the indomitable strength of one who refused to be erased. In the face of darkness, in the face of cruelty, the truth always rises. And so did she.